I mean, I've said performer interview, and actually that's the wrong word, because, right, an interview is not a performance, and particularly now we're very much geared towards being your authentic self in an interview. And I spent a lot of my late teens and early 20s giving answers in interviews, which I knew were the correct answers, but they weren't answers that were aligned to me.
Hello and welcome back to Future You, the podcast brought to you by graduate careers experts Prospects. I'm your host, Emily Slade, and in this episode we speak to Alexis Roy, who works in recruitment. She's here to answer all your job interview questions in our first Q&A.
So I'm Alexis Roy. I'm what is known as a talent acquisition partner or a recruitment professional, and I work in-house for a retailer.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me today on our first Q&A. We have some questions here.
It's very exciting.
Very exciting. Some of them have been written by me, some of them have been sent in by our listeners, and we're just going to go one by one through them. They're all around job interviews.
Yep,
so,
sounds good.
Let's dive in, shall we?
Yeah.
All right, then. This is from Charlie, so thank you, Charlie. Can I reschedule a job interview, or will that make me look bad?
So, I've rescheduled quite a lot of interviews. I would say, obviously, there are things that are unavoidable. So sickness is one of those things. Obviously, if you've got caring responsibilities, sometimes, the unavoidable happens.
Yeah.
I would always say if you need to reschedule an interview, do it as soon as you need to. So obviously if you're ill on the day, that's the earliest availability you can do that. But in advance, I'd say if you've suddenly realised that something's cropped up, always do it on the phone if you can, just because it looks better. But no, it doesn't make you look bad. Obviously, just make sure that when you do eventually do your interview, that you kind of bring your A game and that you're present ready to go. But no, it doesn't make you look bad. Obviously, things happen. So
yeah, of course. Okay, so you'd suggest definitely trying to speak to a human rather than sending an email or text?
I think so. I know sometimes it's difficult, and I know there are reasons why sometimes people feel more comfortable. I'm much better on email or text or WhatsApp than I am in person. But I think sometimes even just for speed value, particularly if it's on the day, much better if you have a contact number just to call up and say, look, I'm not well, or something's happened at home. Is it possible to reschedule? Obviously, if they say no, there's not much you can do about that. But most people are really accommodating.
Yeah.
I've had to reschedule so many recently, and actually since COVID, it's been much more common to reschedule interviews because of people not wanting to, either be in a face-to-face environment where they're not feeling very well, or just not being particularly present because they're feeling rubbish. So it's not uncommon at all. But I would just say try and do it. If it's something that's not an on-the-day emergency, try and do it as soon as you possibly can. Give as much further availability as possible as well. I was
going to say, is it good to come in and be like, I have these dates available at these times, give options? Obviously
be apologetic, just say, I'm so sorry, but XYZ has happened. If the panel are free to kind of reschedule, then I'm available on ABC at XYZ times. At least it's better than I've had cancellations before, which just say I won't be attending the interview today. And that doesn't give me any information as to whether...
ever, or...
so because then that makes me ask more questions, which is, do you want to reschedule? Are you withdrawing? Are you still interested? Whereas at least if you're giving as much information up front, it just... Obviously, sometimes you can't call up and sometimes you can't do it until the day. But, people are very understanding. They know that life happens and sometimes you can't attend for whatever reason, and that's fine.
It did just remind me, literally for this job, I had to reschedule because I was on holiday and it was allowed and I obviously got the job, so... Ooh, fun fact. Oh, okay, the hot topic. Should candidates be worried about AI? So I guess, do you know what this currently looks like and how it's impacting interviews?
Yeah, so I would say that AI is not something to be worried about. Like, AI is there to enhance the human experience rather than to take away from it. It's already involved in quite a lot of interview processes anyway, which you might not necessarily be aware of. So in some, particularly with volume type interviews, so if people are hiring hundreds of people at a time, it's simply not practical to have people doing face-to-face interviews or virtual interviews because it's a lot of scheduling, it takes a lot of time. So what you might have is what are referred to as pre-recorded interviews, where you attend as the candidate, but where you will have questions written on a screen in front of you. So it will say to you, can you tell me about your CV, for example? And then it will give you a specified period of time to record your response on video. And then either a talent acquisition partner will go through those responses and judge them. I say judge them, assess them, shall I say, for want of a better word, that will assess them. There is another type of AI where it will take your responses and actually assess them itself, which is one step further using AI. There are pros and cons to that, but actually the speed at which that kind of platform can help an interview process is really good, because it means that people are being seen a lot quicker, and actually a process from a commercial perspective, particularly if you're a commercial organisation, you can fill roles a lot quicker rather than having the to and fro of trying to arrange actual interviews. So they can be really good because you can also do it in your own time. So if you're doing your interview at 10 o'clock at night, that's entirely up to you. You can record your responses when you feel like you're at your best self. We also, like in the talent community, can use AI note takers. So they're becoming more prominent as well. So I've used note takers previously where I'm in an interview or having a telephone conversation with someone, and rather than me taking physical notes, an AI note taker sits in the background, and all it does is it records the interview, and it will create both a transcript, but it can also then create a summary, and that'll either be in question and answer format or in a sort of summary format, which you can then use to kind of assess post-interview. And those are really useful, because it means that when I'm having a conversation with you, I'm having a conversation with you and I'm engaged in that conversation. Whereas what you often find in kind of traditional interviews is that you're listening to what someone's saying, you're processing the information, and then you're writing it down. And it creates quite a stilted environment,
and stressful.
Quite stressful, and the engagement level's not quite there, because you're not really you're not actively listening. You're hearing, but you're not actively listening. So those are brilliant, because it means that actually I can just focus on the person in front of me. So and it also removes bias, because in the summaries where I might write something how I hear it, an AI note taker doesn't have bias. It literally just gives you a summary, which is really, really useful. So no, I wouldn't say you should be worried about it. Actually, it enhances the whole experience. And actually for certain roles in certain industries, it's actually incredibly helpful, because it means that you as a candidate are put through the process a lot quicker and at a time and in a way that's probably more beneficial for you than it is me calling up and saying, are you free on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday? What times can you do? Me going, it doesn't make any kind of sense from a time perspective.
This is from Flo. She says, I always get stuck when they ask if I have any questions at the end. What kind of questions should I have prepared? And is it okay if I don't have any?
I would always say you should have something. So I would always have questions prepared based on the role itself. So make sure you've got something to ask about the role. Those questions might be answered during the course of the interview. So then I'd have questions prepared on the company itself. So obviously, before you go to an interview, you'd obviously look at the company website, about us. Maybe they've got reports, maybe they've got yearly results, whatever it might be, and have some questions on that. Again, they might answer those in the course of the interview. So then I would have things banked like, what are your expectations of me within the first 6 months if I were to be successful in this role? Or do you have any concerns that I've not covered in anything that I've answered so far? Is there anything else you want to ask me? Or you could ask things like, how would you describe the culture in this business? Because you're then putting the focus back on the interviewer. So, how would you describe the culture? What do you think is the best thing about working here? So make it very interviewer-centred rather than just random, because then you're actually focusing on them as people. So it could be, how would you describe the culture? What do you think the best thing is about working here? What's the most challenging thing about working here from your perspective? Because they probably won't have covered all of that off. Is what I'd say. I would always at least try and have one question, just because it looks like you've prepared and you're engaged in the conversation. Although I appreciate, depending on the role that you go for, you might not have any at the end of it.
And is that fair to say, to be like, well, you've answered all the questions that I had, to be like, look, I did prepare.
Yeah, if they say, like, have you got any questions for us? And you go, well, actually, I had a question about X, Y, and Z, but you've covered that all very amply in the course of the conversation. So I think I'm okay at the moment. But if I do suddenly think of anything, am I okay to contact you after the interview? That's absolutely fine. But I'd always try and have something.
Are there any no-nos? Are there any, like, how do bonuses work? Like pay, like anything around wage, salary, holiday, all of the, like, positive things in the workplace? Should you avoid talking about that sort of thing? Or
that's an interesting question, actually. So I am of the belief that we are moving towards us having to put salaries on adverts, which isn't always the case everywhere. And there are countries where that's actually been, you can no longer ask somebody what they earn, but you also have to stipulate what you're paying. So I suspect that will happen at some point in the UK, when, I don't know. But if you've applied for a role directly, you've not seen a salary, and no one's asked you at that point no one's talked about salary, I think it's perfectly okay to be like, actually, the one thing that's not come up at this point is the remuneration for the role. Can you talk to me a little about that and the benefits of working here? I think it's okay to ask about, again, if that's not come up. But if you've gone through a recruitment consultant, I should say that, if an agency are representing you, that is their role to handle that for you. So don't bring that up in the interview, because that's the consultant's job to kind of handle all of that side of things.
Cool.
But yeah, I'm just trying to think if there's anything that's a no-no to ask.
Yeah, is there anything that if you said it, they'd be like, get out?
I can't think of any.
How badly can you ruin this interview with your final question? I guess is what I'm asking.
I don't think there's anything. I mean, a good question to ask would be like, what does the rest of the process look like? When am I likely to hear? What are your timeframes for this role? All of that sort of thing. I can't think of anything specifically apart from just behaving objectively disgusting, which you wouldn't do in an interview
you wouldn't do anyway.
I think
hot tip.
If you've got all the way through the interview and you've managed to behave politely and professionally, I suspect you're not going to suddenly do a 180 in the last question. But I think, I can't think of anything specific, but generally, if you wouldn't ask it in normal life, don't ask it in an interview would probably be my advice.
Good advice. Cool.
Just behave like a human being and it'll be fine.
Nice. Noted. Excellent. Okay. How do you make a good first impression?
Oh, good question. So I think, like, for interviews specifically, I think be on time is always, and not just on time, be slightly
early.
Yeah, no, I have the opposite problem in that I'm always far too early.
I was going to say, is there such a thing as too early?
I mean, if you're turning up the day before, it's probably a step too far. I'm sorry. Like, I have a problem and I'm working on it. But I would say, if an interview starts, whether it's face-to-face or virtual, if it starts at 2:00, 10 minutes, 15 minutes before is fine.
Yeah.
If you're encroaching on other meetings or interviews that have taken place, then maybe that's a tad too early.
Yeah.
I mean, by all means, if you're... What I would say is if it's a virtual interview, check your tech in advance, right? So they'll send you a link, make sure the link works, make sure your laptop, your sound, your light, everything's working as it should in advance. Then on the day of the interview, log in 15 minutes beforehand, again, to make sure that nothing's broken or stopped working in the interim. And you can just have it hanging in the background and then you're prepared, ready. Don't start joining a call at 2 minutes to 2 only to realise that actually nothing's working, and then you can't.
Yeah, then you
start flapping and you don't know who to contact. And just so to make a good impression, make sure you're there ahead of time, whether that's virtually or physically. Be present, make sure you've got no distractions, make sure you want to have this conversation. Engagement looks different for all sorts of reasons, but make sure that for your engagement level that you are there and present in the conversation, and make sure that you're prepared, that you look like you've done some research, you actually know the role that you're going for and the business that you're going for. And I would say also just make sure that your environment is appropriate. Because, I've hosted interviews where someone's logged in from Costa, for example.
Oh, wow.
And while, yes, they might have amazing internet, you've got people behind you, you've got background noise. It's very distracting. So make sure the environment that you're interviewing in, if it's a virtual interview, is appropriate. And if it's a physical interview, just make sure you're there on time. You're polite. Make sure you're polite to everyone, because people ask.
Yeah, like the receptionist, the first person you meet, be nice to them, because they might ask.
Yeah, what do they like?
Yeah.
And also for your scheduling interviews with a recruitment administrator, for example, be polite to everyone that you speak to, which obviously if you're a normal, nice human being, you will be. But you should be kind of remembering that all the way through that process, all of those touch points are people that talk together and who work together. And so your impression that you create through all of those touch points will create a rounded picture of you as a person. So it's just something to bear in mind.
Anything just to veer slightly off of this on like uniform and dress? I feel it's a bit of a squiggly area, because they'll either tell you or do they tell you they expect you? So
no, we don't. So it used to be very sort of kind of showing my age here, but sort of in the 80s and 90s and early noughties, it was very much women must wear, a blouse and a suit, and men must wear a suit and a tie. It's a little bit more fluid now. And I would say if you're unsure, ask.
Right. Because
certain industries, it's very different. So media, for example, will dress very differently to finance and law. My advice would always be show that you've made an effort. Yeah. So definitely, if they're normal dresses, shirts and trousers for men, for example, maybe put on a tie. Just show that you've gone above and beyond. Yeah. But I would say ask if you're not sure, because you can also. There is a thing about being authentic to yourself. So if you're not a suit and a tie person,
and you're going to be uncomfortable in that,
so then there needs to be, there has been a kind of element of relaxing of the traditional must wear a suit for an interview, with the whole kind of people being their authentic selves and so on. But I would probably suspect that if you are very suited and booted, you probably wouldn't be going for somewhere that wasn't that kind of environment anyway. But be authentic to yourself, ask the question if you're not sure. Yeah. And just look like you've,
got up in time that morning.
Got up in time, that you've not just kind of raced from your bedroom and sat down and, look like you've got ready.
Yeah. And again, even on a virtual one, even if you've got your gym jams on underneath and your big slippers,
no one's going to see you from the...
At least try and present
here. Yeah, 100%.
Nice. Cool. Amazing. Do you have any fun stories of has anyone ever turned up to an interview in a onesie?
No, but someone has. So in COVID, I think because everyone just sort of, the lines were blurred in terms of what was acceptable. We didn't know how to interview virtually. It is an odd concept. I get that. But my advice of if you wouldn't do it in a face-to-face interview, don't do it virtually still stands. A guy that I was interviewing, I could see him sort of fiddling around on the desk, and I didn't know what he was doing. He was rolling himself a cigarette, which he then lit and and started smoking during the interview, which, it's 1970s cool, but not in 2020.
If this is Mad Men, go for it.
And because I'm terribly, terribly British and awkward, I just didn't raise it, and afterwards thought, I don't know if that's okay.
Was there a mark against them because of it? Did you then have an impression that went into the, would they have not gotten further in the application process because of it? Or was it just something that you were a bit like, that's a funny story?
I just sort of internalised it and thought, I'll raise that with the other person interviewing with me, because obviously you can't say anything at the time. But I just remember thinking, you wouldn't do that if we were sitting in a room with you. Yeah. So clearly you feel comfortable at home. That's great.
Wonderful.
But I wouldn't recommend it as something to do in a virtual or face-to-face interview. Just don't. It's an hour. Wait until the end of the hour.
So, the confidence that must have exuded
Yeah,
it's quite impressive. But okay. Okay, so we've kind of already covered this. Of if you're interviewing online, is there any etiquette to follow, background, outfit, etc.? So we've kind of covered that. Was there anything else you'd want to add?
Yeah, so I just there are considerations for virtual interviews that maybe don't seem obvious because you don't have to think about them in a physical context. So, like I said, don't do them in a public space. So don't have children running around in the background. Don't be in a cafe or a playground, whatever it might be. Make sure you're in a quiet space, but also think about the lighting, which sounds really stupid, but the number of times I've joined a Teams meeting, for example, and I sit next to a window most of the time, when it's very bright, it actually makes you look like you're in a cave and you're not visible. And obviously the interviewer wants to see you.
Yeah.
So make sure you have a kind of play around in terms of like, where's your Wi-Fi the strongest? So don't choose a room where the Wi-Fi is particularly weak. But make sure that where you do choose to sit is uninterrupted. There's decent sound, there's decent light. I always blur my background, and I would kind of encourage people to do the same, just because whatever you've got behind you, whether it's, art or curtains or whatever it is, people will naturally look at what's behind you and go, oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
And they it's human nature. You suddenly go, oh, that's an interesting vase. Wonder where they got that. And suddenly you're not listening to the person that's talking to you.
Yes.
So just blur your background. That way no one can see what's behind you. If you don't want to blur it, at least make sure that it's presentable and you haven't got like a wardrobe open with clothes flying out and stuff, or animals wandering around in the background. And actually that's a point from my own perspective. I've got dogs, and the number of times they have interrupted me in meetings. So just make sure that if you've got young children like I do, dogs like I do, that if you've got a particularly important meeting, that they're not present.
Yeah.
Because it's, like I said at the start, like life happens and sometimes people will interrupt you, but ideally in an interview, make sure that people are out of the house or at least definitely out of the room.
Yeah.
And that your sound's working, your light's appropriate, that kind of thing. So,
I mean, I feel almost everyone these days is kind of invested in like a ring light or whatever, but like even if you haven't, you can just figure out from the window or play around with the overhead lights and
make sure that you are fully visible so that you don't look like a shadow. Because it's just people want to be able to engage with you. So
you look like a talking head in a documentary.
Yeah, exactly.
That's trying to keep their identity secret. So this is from Tom. Should I consider having notes for my interview, or will it make me look unprepared?
Oh, interesting. Do you know what? I think notes are fine. As long as you're not reading verbatim, I would say. So if someone says, tell me about yourself, and you then literally read like a sort of page of prose, it probably doesn't create a platform for that level of engagement with the other person, is what I'd say. But if you need notes, particularly if you're been asked to do a presentation or a task, then notes, absolutely. But also if you just want to be like, oh, actually, I noted on your website that X, Y, and Z, or I noticed in the news that ABC. Just so you've got them as a prompt, that's absolutely fine. But as I say, don't read directly from it. Because then they don't want you to read. They want you to have a conversation, have a dialogue. So absolutely fine for you to take notes.
Maybe like would you recommend sticking to like 1A4? Because I often find that I follow the like STAR method, which is situation, task, action, result. Nailed it. And that if they're like, tell us a time where you showed great customer service and you want to do that with, well, here's the situation, here's the task at hand that I did, here's the action that I did to do it, and here's the result of that. And that's a fully rounded question. And of course, the second somebody asks the best customer service you've ever delivered is, you've forgotten any time that you ever worked in retail. So again, is it just a case of having like, remember when you did this, like bag in loft?
You could have, whatever it is, X situation as a prompt to yourself. I would just make sure that
write it all out.
Don't write it all out. And if it's going to make you kind of stare at the table, constantly referring to it, then I would maybe try and have something that's a bit sort of easier to remember, possibly, or to recall. Also, with interviews now, sometimes they're competency based, so where you do the STAR format. Sometimes they're strengths based, so you would format your answers slightly differently. And sometimes they are, how do you deal with conflict? which is a lot more about your potential and hypothetical.
Yeah.
Because particularly for people who have not had a role before, maybe it's their first role or second role, you won't have a great deal of experience to do a competency-based question on. So we would look more, or say we, like talent acquisition partners, might look more for your potential at dealing with a situation or your approach to a situation rather than any kind of tangible example that you might have. But you will be told before an interview whether it's a competency-based, strengths-based or whatever.
Right.
But yeah, absolutely use notes to kind of prompt yourself if you need to, but I would just make sure that they're kind of limited and they don't make you look down a lot because they want you to have a dialogue, not to read off a bit of paper.
Yeah.
So.
How do you ask the more general ones? Like, how do I deal with conflict? Like, how do you like, that feels so like a big question to me. I'm like, wow, how existential.
Yeah, it's so you kind of have to be hypothetical with it. So if someone says, how do you deal with conflict? I say, well, if I was presented with an X situation, this would be my approach. And then you can feed an example into it.
Nice.
If you have one. So for example, when XYZ happened. But generally it's more to see what your approach would be if you were to deal with a conflict situation.
And you can use an example from outside of a workplace.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. This is from Abigail. How do I ask about money?
Cool. So we kind of touched on this earlier. I would say if you've applied for a role and there's been no salary advertised and at no point anyone's discussed it with you and you're a direct application to that role, you've not been represented by a consultant, then I would just say, look, really great to hear about the role. Really enjoyed the conversation so far. I just wondered if you could talk to me more about the remuneration and benefits for the role, because obviously it wasn't on the advert and I don't think we've discussed that so far. That's absolutely fine. You can ask about remuneration. They'll either say to you, yes, the range for the role is this, or they might tell you that it's a specific salary. It just depends on the role, but it's absolutely okay for you to say, if it's not been spoken about at the time. If it was on the advert, then I'd almost be tempted not to, because if you've been given a range, then you know what the range is.
And is that then something that when they offer you the job, they'll offer you something within that range? And then is that your opportunity to potentially negotiate that if you're like, well, actually, I believe that I should be up the other end of the range? Or could it come up in the interview where they're like, where in the range do you think you'd be? They
might not ask you where in the range you'd be, but they might ask you what your expectations are. There is a general trend to move away from asking people what they're on because that plays into things like gender pay gap and minority pay gap. But they might say, what are your expectations? My advice would be that whatever you've said in your application or whatever you say in your interview is the figure you stick to, purely because the question might come up if you say if the range is 25 to 30, for example, thousand, and you've said on your application I'm looking for 27.5. If they then say, so you're looking for 27.5, and you go, no, I'm looking for 29, the question then comes up, how have you increased that? It's a genuine question. What's changed? Genuinely, like, what's changed for that figure to have shifted?
And it could have changed in that, like, well, I've moved house, I'm now further away from the office, so my commute would be longer, so I would need to cover blah, blah, blah.
So just be prepared to be able to justify why that expectation has changed. But yeah, if it was on the advert and you're aware of what that advert was, then I would be probably disinclined to bring it up because they'll probably just ask you what your expectations are. They may bring it up in the interview and say, can you tell me what your notice period are and salary expectations are? But if at no point it's been discussed, then absolutely it's fine to say, can you tell me a bit more about the remuneration and benefits? And as I said earlier, if you're represented by a recruitment agency, then that's their job to do that. So, and they will probably tell you, don't discuss money, we'll pick that side of things up.
Nice.
So.
And then I guess it's just about knowing, you know, what you need. Like,
exactly.
Going in with a figure that you've figured out because of your lifestyle or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Nice. This is from Dan. It's said you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. What red flags should you look for during an interview?
Interesting. So, I mean, obviously, like I said earlier, like an interview is as much like just humans having a chat, right? So if anyone asks you a question that you would feel uncomfortable about in normal kind of not interview life, then that's probably a red flag. So if they ask you anything to do with a protected characteristic, for example, that's a red flag. If anyone asks you, are you intending on having children? What's that kind of thing? That's not okay. And that's a question that shouldn't be asked. Although I would hope that at this point in time, most people have stopped asking those kind of questions. But yeah, as a general rule, I would say if they ask you anything that makes you personally feel uncomfortable, and I can't think of an example other than a protected characteristic.
Yeah, of course.
Anything to do with protected characteristics or anything that makes you genuinely feel uncomfortable as a person is probably a red flag. And that's, for you to kind of then decide whether that's something you want to progress with or I would suggest probably not.
That makes sense.
I have been asked about protected characteristics years ago. But yes, I was asked about my children and whether I was married and...
Were they asking the men that?
Yeah, exactly. So it's just to bear in mind that if you think, oh, that feels like a bit of a weird question, it probably is. And to kind of take that on board.
Yeah. So. Nice. Okay, nice. Okay. I tend to get nervous before interviews. What ways can I prepare myself to ensure that I get through it smoothly?
I think nerves are really... like a really important part of an interview. To be fair, if you're nervous, it means that you care. I
was going to say, if you're not nervous, I'd be worried.
Yeah, like if you were just like, I am going to absolutely smash this, I would be concerned.
Yeah.
It's fine to feel confident, but I think nerves are like what keep you engaged because it shows that you actually care about the outcome of this situation. Obviously, do your prep. So look at the role profile, look at the company website, look on, if you've got access to LinkedIn, look at the people who are going to be interviewing you and kind of get a sense of who they are. As long as you've checked that your tech or your journey to the interview place, if you're doing it face-to-face, are all fine, that should kind of help with any kind of nerves around, oh my God, am I going to get there on time? Oh my God, is my sound working? Oh my God, I can't get my laptop to work. Try and alleviate any of those concerns by being as prepared as you possibly can.
Yeah.
And then I think actually in the interview itself, if you're nervous, it's fine to have water, ask for a drink. And if someone asks you a question, you don't have to answer immediately. It is actually fine for you to take a couple of seconds and say, can I just take a moment to think about that?
Yeah.
And then to give the answer rather than racing in with the first thing that comes to mind, which might not be your best example. It might not be articulated as best as you would, like it to be. So it's fine to take your time. They would rather you gave not the right answer, the answer that is best for you rather than the first thing that comes to mind. And I would also say that interviewers want you to do well. They actually want to find the person for the role. So they're not there to catch you out.
Yeah, trip you up.
Yeah, we're not trying to find ways for you to slip up. We actually want you to give great answers. We want to have really good conversations. So I would absolutely rather you spend 5 seconds, 10 seconds just thinking about what you want to say and then formulating your answer rather than just being like, oh my God, I have to say something and then just blurting out whatever comes to mind.
Yeah.
So I would say take your time, prepare adequately, know where you're going or know how you're logging on and everything's fine. And that should help. And breathe.
Yeah.
Breathe.
Just breathe.
So,
nice. Yeah. Amazing. What are some of the most common interview questions and how can I prepare for them?
Cool. So I would say most interviews will start with something like, tell us about yourself, which is normally just a nice warm-up question. And some people go one way or the other. Some people just be like, my name's Lex. And
I was going to say, whenever I'm confronted with that, I'm like, that's the hardest question because I've not prepared for it. Like, what do you want to know? Like, how much of this do I go into?
So I think, say who you are. You talk about what you're doing. I'm a such and such at so-and-so currently. I've had XYZ experience in A, B and C. Give yourself a sort of potted history.
Okay. Any like hobbies? Is it worth leaning in to being like, oh, I'm a big runner and I completed a marathon last year? Or is it best to try and stick to like more professional things?
No, I think particularly if you're earlier on in your career and you maybe don't have as much wealth of experience to lean on, then absolutely to be like, I'm a keen runner or I play this sport or I sing in this group or just to show you've got an element of something else to you. But particularly, actually, if something might have transferable skills into the workplace. So, for example, if you play a team sport, actually that's really interesting because it shows that you work alongside other people and that you can work as a team and that you're potentially competitive or whatever it might be. There are elements of that kind of hobby which might help your day-to-day role. So absolutely mention hobbies if it's appropriate. But yeah, they will normally ask you, tell us a little about yourself. They might ask you, why did you apply for this role? Which means you have to remember why you've applied and what you've applied for.
And not just be like, because I need to pay rent.
Yeah, exactly. Like, particularly if you've gone, and I completely understand why this happens, but if you've gone on to a job site and applied for 10, 20 jobs, just like scattered on your CV, and people call you up even and go, so what made you apply for this role? And you think, I can't.
Who are you?
I don't even know what I've applied for. It doesn't show that you're particularly invested in that role. Yeah. So keep a note. Obviously, if you're in an actual interview, you presumably know what you're interviewing for, but they might ask you, why this role? Why this company? So you be prepared to talk about what interests you about that particular business, whether it's a charity, whether it's a commercial organisation, whatever it might be. Have a reason why you're applying to them because people want to know that you're invested in them and that role, not just any role. Yeah. I would say they're probably the top three. Yeah. Role, company, and a bit about you. So be prepared for those three.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Ooh. This is Sophia. How important do you think it is to know about the company beforehand? So I think that might be the last one, and it's a perfect... I think sort of we've covered quite a lot of it already.
It's super important. Yeah. Particularly if it's a particular industry that maybe you're not familiar with. So if you've never worked in a legal practice before or if you've never worked in finance, they're very different in terms of sector and specialism and how they operate. So it's really important that you do some background on who they are, the size they are, what kind of areas they operate within. Really important because if they say to you, what do you know about us? And you go, I don't know.
Yeah, nothing.
It doesn't show that level of preparation. Yeah. But also, again, they want you to join them. So they want to know why you want to join them. And if you haven't really got any reasons behind that, they might question why that is. So, yeah, definitely have a reason why you're joining them. I think sometimes interviews are seen as a little bit of a kind of mysterious or stressful. And I see why they're seen as stressful because you're like, oh, my God, I have to perform. I mean, I've said perform at interview, and actually that's the wrong word because, an interview is not a performance. And particularly now, we're very much geared towards being your authentic self in an interview. And I spent a lot of my late teens and early 20s giving answers in interviews, which I knew were the correct answers, but they weren't answers that were aligned to me. So if someone had asked me, do you really like working as part of a team? I'd be like, yeah, I really like working as part of a team. And then I'd get 6 months into a role and be like, I hate this because actually I prefer working on my own. I'm much better as a sole contributor. Of course, I can work as part of a team, but I don't like a lot of team. It's just the way my brain is wired. So what I would say is that don't try and second guess what the interviewer wants you to say. Be true to yourself and what you feel your answer is. If you then don't get the role, it's not the right role for you. Yeah. And that is genuinely true. And it comes with kind of, I sound really old saying this, but with years of experience, is that by giving the answer you think they want to hear, if you then get the job, you may not be happy in that role. And ultimately, that's not the right thing for you. So if I went for an interview now for a role where I had to be suited and booted and I couldn't have my tattoos on show and I couldn't wear my nose ring, that's not the right environment for me. And you shouldn't try and pigeonhole yourself into something that you think should be the right role. Ultimately, you may not get every role that you interview for, and that is fine. But if you're going to be authentic in your interview and give the answers that are right to you, you will end up in a role and an environment and a culture that ultimately supports you and is the right one for you. So that's what I would say.
That's brilliant advice. So I guess the key to crushing an interview is definitely knowing who you are. Having a good understanding of who you are. And that seems simple, but actually I also think it's a quite a big ask because I think, you can go years and be discovering yourself. So really think
100%.
about when you're doing that application process, and obviously it can get really stressful and you can start mass applying to everything out of the fear of like, oh God, I need a job and stuff. But just do try and take that time and remember like who you are and what you want and try and seek those out.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
Nice. Perfect. Thank you.
Cool.
Thanks so much to Alexis for joining me today. For more information on how to prepare for a job interview, you can head to prospects.ac.uk. If you've enjoyed the episode, please head to Apple or Spotify and leave us a review. And if you have a question that didn't get answered today, there are more Q&As on the way, so do send them in via our Instagram. You'll find the link in the description, or email podcast@prospects.ac.uk. Thank you, as always, for listening, and good luck on your journey to future you.